Morgan Stanley, and one of the chief architects of this node. RidhamDesai joins us to talk about that node. Rhythm, I don't want to question you because if this is India's decade, it's great news, but I want to thank you for talking to us about this node.
Well, it's my pleasure to be with you. I love you.
Thank you so much.
You're one of the best people out there in this business. So it's always good chatting with you.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for that. I'm already happy. Now, let's talk about what's the bedrock.
But do question me.
Of course I will.
It will be fun.
Yes.
Yeah, challenge everything in that report if you have managed to go through the whole thing.
Yeah.
But yeah.
A fair degree of it, a fair bit of it. Okay. So, but I first want to start you. What's the bedrock of this statement, which is that why this is India's decade, and this note as well?
See, Neeraj, I actually look at India as a quintessentially self-help story in a world that is highly challenged. And it's not about the Russia-Ukraine war. It's about a world that is facing two big, in fact, I would say 4 Ds, okay, which is, one is demographics. It's aging. It's really aging. And when Elon Musk says that, population is a bigger problem than climate change, I kind of agree with him. It's very hard to reverse, population declines. And, some major population declines are likely to happen in the coming years. The second is decarbonization. As the war is proving, it's not going to be an easy path. And, the conviction that the planet had on decarbonization is going to get, rattled in the coming months. Especially if the war doesn't turn its back, and even if it doesn't, what countries in Europe have experienced, for example, is certainly going to reset their thinking. The third is digitalization. Okay, this is a disruptive force. It's going to take some businesses down, and every 2-3 decades, disruptive forces happen. I don't think the disruption of the 2020s is anything special. I always point to the 1870 decade for the peak of disruption. That was the decade in which man invented the internal combustion engine, the telephone, and the electric bulb. It forever changed how we moved. It forever changed how we communicated. And of course, the electric bulb had its own implications. So can you imagine, these were probably amongst the biggest inventions of the industrial era. And they all happened in a single decade. So you can imagine what that did, right? So, but digitalization is a force that we have to currently reckon with. And it's going to have some, disruption. So, these changes that are happening in the world are likely to challenge how the world progresses. And in the midst of this, India is actually making its own story. So, that's why quintessentially self-help. So, there are 3 things that are happening. And those are based on 4 foundations. And 3 out of these 4 foundations are India's own doing. So the first foundation is the multipolar world thesis that we have as Morgan Stanley, which is essentially the world was bipolar. China dominated production, US dominated consumption. Now it's becoming multipolar and it's going to spread out. India is a big beneficiary of that. India will receive some of those production investments for many reasons, amongst them including the fact that India is also a growing consumer market. So it's an attractive destination to put up a factory. And the government is feeding this with its tax incentives, etc. The second is our commitment to Paris Accord, okay, which means that we are now committed to net zero in 2070, and there is a massive investments happening in renewables. Now, this may not have been thought about at the time, or maybe it was thought about, but the implication of this is that we're liberating ourselves from the volatility in the energy markets, which brought us down to our knees in 1990 when Iraq decided to attack Kuwait. And I always consider August 2, 1990 as a very important date in Indian history, modern Indian history, as important as any date that you can think of. Because that day when Saddam Hussein decided to attack Kuwait and oil prices doubled, basically our balance sheet went bust. Yeah. And we had to go to the IMF in the subsequent months. And the IMF put this condition that you got to open up. Otherwise, on our own, we may not have chosen 1991 as the year to open up. Maybe it happens, it would have happened in 2021, right? So, the Paris Accord is therefore, the signing of the Paris Accord is a seminal moment. Then Aadhaar, and hats off to Nandan Nilekani. And I keep speaking to him about this, that, he's just it's a single man genius to have, come up with this concept. And it went through its own, ups and downs. We wrote about this extensively in 2017, but this whole digital infrastructure is very unique to India. No other country has this system, and we'll come to that a little later in our conversation. And the fourth thing is, the shift in government policy, which has taken many, many years, but we are now entrenched in a policy that is targeting to lift the share of profits in GDP, therefore fuel an investment cycle, therefore create jobs, create wages, and, create a virtuous cycle of growth. So these are the foundations to what happen to be, three pillars that are driving India's decade, or the new India as we call it. One is offshoring. So we're gaining from this global multipolar world thesis, which is shifting production to India. And even while COVID was such a bad thing, the silver lining on that dark cloud was that the CEO around, the typical MNC in the world suddenly became comfortable with work from home. And then it is actually much better to work from Mumbai than Florida. At least it's a lot cheaper.
Right.
So jobs are shifting to India as a consequence. So we were already there in the services, export market, but our market share in the last 2 years has gone up by 60 basis points from 3.7 to 4.3. It's a big increase in market share in a 2 years time frame. And I think this is going up further. The second pillar is the energy transition. So, in part because of the Paris Accord, a lot of our incremental energy needs will be met by renewable sources, mostly solar and hydrogen. And the second thing is that over the past 10 years, we have increased our access to energy. See, energy consumption is not only about prosperity, it's also about access. And in fact, it's very intertwined with economic prosperity. The fact is that numerous villages, hundreds of thousands of villages in India did not have electricity.
Yeah.
Now, all of our 6 lakh plus villages have electricity. This is going to lead to a big transformation in energy consumption. So we are making an estimate there that our per capita, per day consumption of energy in all forms, which includes electricity, it includes transportation fuel, includes food, goes from 950 watts to around 1500 watts in the next. So about a 60% jump in 10 years. Just fathom the comparison. The US is at 9,000 watts. So the average Indian right now consumes about 900 watt bulbs in a day. Okay, and that's going to go to 1500 watt bulbs a day. And that is such a big transformation that is underway. It will have multiple implications on growth, on our macro stability, on inflation, on our fertilizer subsidy, on cold storage chains, on the way we consume food, the way the food reaches our plate, many. We have even not touched the tip of the iceberg in this report on this, because that requires another 150 pages for me to deal with. And the third is the digital infrastructure, which is on the India stack. And for those who are familiar with the India stack, and I'll assume that your audience is, at the bottom we have Aadhaar, which is your eKYC. And then we have built the DigiLocker layer. Then we have built the e-sign layer. Nowhere in the world can I sign a document in the cloud, okay, like I can do in India. I can sign my property document in the cloud, rental document in the cloud, okay. On that, we built all these payment layers, which is UPI, FASTag. I mean, imagine FASTag. I know I'm going on and on, but FASTag is revolutionary, okay. It's a layer built on the India stack. And now there are these 3 big layers coming on it, which are very disruptive. One of them is ONDC, which is our digital commerce layer. It will change the way e-commerce is done, and the world will look at us with awe, because we are unbundling the e-commerce experience.
Yes.
See, today when you do an e-commerce transaction, it's bundled, which is the e-commerce website will offer a range of products to you from specific vendors. You will have to pick up that. Then it will decide for you how it is going to be delivered, and it will decide for you how you will make your payment. In the ONDC world, everything is unbundled. So first of all, you're not limited on your product range. You're not limited by the vendors you choose. You may want to pick up the product from your next door Kirana store or from a dry food store in Kashmir, on Srinagar, right? And then the way it has to be delivered to you, you will decide. Okay. And the way you make the payment is also your decision. So the whole experience is unbundled. The next layer is Open, which is the credit enablement network. And that is going to change the way we lend money. So I was actually discussing this earlier today. I sit on the advisory board of an NGO called Project Mumbai. And we were discussing about this thing that the government has essentially is pushing state governments to create more lending to hawkers. And Maharashtra government apparently is now on board with it. So, there are maybe hundreds of thousands of hawkers in Mumbai. They have no access to formal credit. Sure. Why? Because they have no asset on which they can make a pledge. Because all our lending is asset based. Under Open, it will become cash flow based. Okay. Now, the Vada Pav guy sitting on in Back Bay Reclamation, that famous guy, today he doesn't have an asset to pledge. He cannot grow his business without credit. He can pledge his cash flow. And because he's taking payments on UPI, he's got a record of cash flows. He can prove to the bank that, see, I am making so much money in a day. Okay. And the bank can rely on that record. And, if you're filing GST, if you're filing income tax returns, even better, because all those things are on the India stack and you can actually make a credit decision, a very, very sound credit decision. So this will revolutionize credit. And the third layer is on health, which I think, again, we have only touched upon very briefly in this report because that is another major change. But it will have an impact on how we do insurance. And again, it's going to be quite unique to India. So these three big idiosyncratic pillars give us the confidence that, we are heading into maybe a decade, 2 or 3 of India's dominance of the world. And we did some estimates using my global colleagues. India will be, in the next decade, according to our estimates, a staggering 20% of global growth. Okay? Digest that. 1/5. We are right now 3.5% of global GDP.
Yes.
We will drive 20% of GDP growth in the world. Okay? So there is no way a CEO or an equity market investor can, ignore this country. Okay? He or she will have to be engaged. And digest this other number. We are $3.5 trillion. By our estimate, we are, hitting 7.9 trillion in 10 years. We're adding more economic output than we have added since this country was formed. Okay, in 10 years. So just imagine what this is going to do. Okay, I know I'm going on and on, but it is inverting the pyramid, the income pyramid. So our income pyramid sits like this.
Yeah.
The lowest layer, the poorest layer is the biggest. The uppermost layer is the smallest. Obviously, that's how an income pyramid is. At the top, which is households that earn $35,000 a year, the number is 5 million. Okay. So India is not an attractive market for luxury goods because that doesn't mean it has enough demand for a Louis Vuitton or for a Cartier or for anybody, right? And at the bottom we have people who are struggling to make 2 ends meet. I mean, they're just barely going past roti kapda makan. They earn $1,000, a year on a per capita basis. That's just enough for them to have, life. This is inverting. Okay, so it's becoming like this. It's not going to become like this, obviously, but it'll become like this. At the top, that number goes from 5 million to 25 million. And I think a few companies have already caught on to this. So both the names I mentioned, Louis Vuitton and Cartier, both now have their global ambassador as Deepika Padukone. Okay? Because they can see that this is going to be the market in which they will sell more stuff than any other market. This is exactly what happened to China 20 years ago. And India is on the verge of that transformation. At the bottom, these people rise. They'll start painting their homes. They'll start sending their kids to school. They'll start buying internet connections. They'll start, buying better mobile phones, etc. So there's a whole transformation happening to consumption. So a lot of things, I'm so excited. It's unbelievable.
And viewers, thank you for tuning in today. But you said it all, Ridham. No, really. But, the interesting thing is, and I tweeted about it, these days when we do Twitter Spaces, wherein people log in for the audio conversation, there are people tuning in on the space at 9 p.m. from New York. and asking guests, asking me, how is it that we can invest into India? What is the most efficient way? Is there an index which we can do? Is this index better than that? And I don't have an answer to that.
Thank God that access is not so easy.
Yeah.
One of my biggest fears is that everybody joins this party and we get a bubble.
That's true.
Okay, and bubbles are bad.
That's true.
Because they crash. And when they crash, they leave a lot of scars. So we rather have these people come a little later to the party, because right now our own brethren, our retail investors are on top of it, and let them exhaust it, because for the time being, if both foreigners and domestics start bidding stocks, then these prices are not going to stay sensible anymore.
Yeah, that's
so
true.
My one worry is, and this has happened, okay, because in 1992 we had a bubble in India. The market was trading at 50 times earnings and it crashed. And the scars were so deep that a whole generation of retail investors shunned the equity markets. And it needed that whole generation to pass before equity investors returned to Indian equity market. So I think, we let it happen more slowly. Yeah. It'll be more enjoyable.
I guess so. Okay. Some challenges and some positives to this. Now, a couple of things that I want to understand from you, right? In your report, a number of times you've spoken about the India stack and spoken about how it moves us from a prepaid economy to a postpaid economy. Can you talk about the significance of this?
That's actually Nandan's phrase. So I've stolen it from him. I've stolen a few things from him actually.
Sure.
Without asking him. But prepaid to postpaid is essentially what we saw in the mobile world, right? Which is you first paid for the services and then the service was delivered to you. Now there are multiple reasons for that. One primary reason is that there is no credit available. Okay, so you cannot have a postpaid economy. Postpaid means I will pay for it later, which means today you give me a loan, give it to me on credit and I'll pay for it later. That can only happen when there is access to credit. And that's what India stack is going to change. And the numbers are very attractive for India because private credit to GDP is 57%. Okay, so it's pretty low. Just to contextualize this, that number is 225% in China. Okay, 4 times more. And yes, of course, India's per capita income is lower, so it ought to have lower credit. But even adjusted for that, India is, I dare say, underlevered, especially corporate India, because corporate debt to GDP is just 46%. Okay, and therefore there's a lot of scope for this to rise. And that's, I think, what will happen in the next 10 years, because access to credit improves and the starting point of the balance sheet is underlevered. Incomes are rising, so people will spend their future. See, when you take a loan, you're spending your future. But in this country, we have never spent our future.
True.
Okay, my father never borrowed money. In large part, I've never borrowed money. So we have never spent our future. We have only spent our current income. Whereas in the US, people have spent their future, which is, one of the big problems that we have in the world, which is the indebtedness is very high. So I think India, we will see that because the capacity to spend the future only arises when you have access to credit. And that is what the India stack is enabling.
Okay. The other question is on the energy transition. Now, what I want to understand from you is when you're talking about this whole move that will happen, we'll consume more, there'll be different ways in which we are doing. Are you trying to emphasize on the way, the spend that happens into the energy revolution that comes in, or India's dependence going down on globally imported fuel sources, which leads India to, of course, have a better quality of life, but with power sources which are indigenously manufactured? So
both. Neeraj, both. Both of them are happening simultaneously, and that's never happened in the history of the world. Never happened. It's going to be the first time the world will witness a transition in energy in terms of consumption and sources. Okay, so we have seen, source transition, like the electric bulb was a source transition from gas to electricity. Okay, and then, we went to auto fuels. That was another source transition that happened from horses. So we were consuming horse energy and then we went to fuel energy. But in India, not only is an energy transition happening, we're also seeing this big transition in the level of consumption. And that's very simple to understand. You look at the penetration of refrigerators in India, for example, right? We don't have refrigerators. And it will get refrigerated because as incomes rise, people will buy refrigerators. People will buy air cooling and air heating. We don't have that. It's not ubiquitous. It's not easily available. These are very simple and basic things in the Western Hemisphere. Okay, they are luxury goods for most Indians.
That's
Okay,
true.
so that is going to change in the next several years as more people rise up the income pyramid, and that's all. These are energy intensive utilities, so they will consume energy. The other source of energy consumption is travel. There's going to be a major boom in travel, both internal and external. And that is also possible only because incomes rise. So it is circular. And as we have said in the report, that energy access and prosperity are circular.
That's
so the more you give energy, the more prosperity you get. Because the more you travel, the more jobs you create. The more jobs you create, the more you travel. So, travel is going to boom. I mean, that's, vacations will boom. Okay, so that's one thing. And then the source, which is, it's transitioning to renewables. Now, this is somewhat forced upon us, but it's also something we would want to do because we, I think, have been too vulnerable to global energy cycles. And, this is a good point for us to liberate ourselves from that.
And you reckon in your assumptions that over the course of this decade, a large portion of that will become domestic oriented, so to say?
Yeah, so our estimates are slightly less optimistic compared to the government, which I feel comfortable with. But maybe we are, underestimating this move because some really large private sector companies are engaged in this, and I cannot see why and how they are going to be unable to deliver it. There are lots of debates, especially around hydrogen, but I think they'll probably get addressed in the next few months, and it will become a viable fuel source for India. So, this is possible. India is endowed with very good natural conditions for renewable energy. Okay, we have just not tapped it.
Okay.
Now we are tapping it. We have sunlight in 80% of our country for 80% of the year. Very few countries have that. Okay, so we have a very large coastline. We can, wind energy is not as effective, but it is possible in India more than almost anywhere else. Okay, so this is something we have not tapped into. Now we are tapping into it. So I think it will happen. Give or take a few,
The reason I harp so much upon it is because when you write in your report, where can we go wrong? Amongst the 3 or 4 or 5 things, the one thing that stood out was energy, right? Because if a lot of people are saying that, I mean, to quote an ex-colleague of yours, if oil is the new data for the decade, and if India still relies on imported energy, and if energy prices stay higher and elevated, then that could prove to be
absolutely
an Achilles heel.
So all this doesn't take that away because this transition happens like this, right?
Sure.
We're not here, we're still here, right? And energy prices can go like this now. So that is going to be disruptive and it will cause pain. And we have become a bit more resilient to it than we were in the past. I think I explained this on a previous show, which is largely because of the way our external balances are being funded. It's largely FDI now and not FPI. Portfolio investors tend to be highly sensitive to short-term fluctuations in energy prices and have in the past reacted adversely to rising energy prices and caused disruption to both markets and macro. It's not happened this year. The consensus view in February was India is going to be in trouble because of the war, energy prices are going to rise. Nothing of that sort has happened because the funding on the external side is very stable. It's long-term funding which is less sensitive to oil. So 50% of the problem has been resolved. The other 50% of the problem is that we still import energy and therefore, that will get resolved over time. But till the time it's resolved, it is still a risk.
Inshallah, as they say. But, viewers, you understood by this one interview, as also the past, it's almost impossible to cross-question or beat RidhamDesai on numbers and memory. So I will not do that. What I will do, though, is quote a number, 25 years. RidhamDesai, congratulations on 25 glorious years at Morgan Stanley.
Thank you so much, Neeraj. Thank you.
Well, this was a pleasure. Thank you so much for this report and this conversation. Bunch of insights there.
Thank you.